We'd like to invite our listeners to attend our annual benefit dinner for the Doc Booth Foundation on April 12th at 6 p.m. at the Dixie Convention Center. This year, we're honoring the great Mary Esther Staley Putnam, who has been a pillar in this community. If you can attend or would like to donate, you can buy tickets at docboothfoundation.org.
They promised to go wherever Brigham sent them and not leave until he told them they could leave. Does that help you understand why we're still in Santa Clara?
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie spirit. It is an amazing, wonderful day in Dixie. It's actually raining outside today, and that's something that makes all three of the people here in the studio with me today smile. They're all smiling. They're all children of people who smiled every time it rained, and we're probably in a little bit better mood on days when it rained because of what that means in this dry country. But I feel so blessed today to have Sherrie Anderson, Claudia West, and Paul Graf with me. They are representing the wonderful, awesome people of Santa Clara, Utah, and representing that spirit of that town, and going to be part of how we tie that whole spirit of Santa Clara to the spirit of Dixie. And I look at Sherrie Graf Anderson. Sherrie, you actually grew up in St. George. All of your ancestors were from Santa Clara, well, at least your Swiss ancestors, but you grew up in St. George. Claudia West grew up in Santa Clara. She's a Dutchman through and through. And Paul Graf, President Paul Graf, one of the great, great men of Santa Clara, is with us today. And Paul, you grew up in Santa Clara.
Right.
And still live there.
Right. I've lived in four houses in Santa Clara, two with my parents, and then we raised our family in one house, and then later, after our mission, we got another house, and they're all within 2 miles of each other.
That is awesome. This is so fun to be able to be together today and talk about this great, great town. And Sherrie, perhaps we could start with you. I think all of us look to you for what you've done with the museum in Santa Clara, with Swiss Days, along with the other two people seated with you here and many others. But Sherrie, could you just talk to us about Santa Clara, what it means to you, and how all of this came to be?
Well, I can go two ways here. The first one is, as you talked about the rain, growing up, I always heard the story of how my great-grandmother was born in the fort in Santa Clara, and she had only been there from Switzerland for 2 weeks before she was born, or maybe a month. Could have been a month. And I think it was more a month. Anyway, she was there when the flood came. And so Jacob Hamlin, we've all probably heard this story about Jacob Hamlin, and others came to rescue them. They forgot that this new mother and her baby were in the fort, and when it started washing away, everybody evacuated and then remembered there was a mother, and the dad was outside looking for driftwood to burn in the fire and didn't even realize what was happening. But I always heard that story, and then I would see the Santa Clara Creek. Everybody's kind of the river now, but it was always the Santa Clara Creek to me. And you could step across it, It was just like a little trickle of water. So I always wondered, how could that, wash the fort away and everything? And then we had those floods in the early 2000s, and then I saw, how it could really happen. But when people come in the museum, I just say, I like to tell them briefly, how Santa Clara was settled and how all these people were joining the church in Europe and coming to Salt Lake, and Brigham Young had to have places to put them. They couldn't all live in Salt Lake. And so he would send out scouts and missionaries, and they would go to different areas in Utah, Nevada, California, Idaho, New Mexico, Arizona, all around. And they would look for places for them to live, and then if they got a place established, then they would send a group. And so they did that in 1854. They came, and then they built the fort and stayed there. And then in 1861, in November, Brigham Young just stood up in General Conference and called these people, our great-grandparents, to come and settle in Santa Clara. And when I first moved to Santa Clara, a lot of the people who grew up there assumed that they all knew each other in Switzerland, and that they just knew each other, and they were this one big group, and they just came together to Salt Lake, and then they came together to Santa Clara. But it wasn't true. Some of them had been in Salt Lake and that area for up to 2 years before they were called to come down, and others had barely gotten to Salt Lake. Some of them did know each other, but they really didn't. The only thing they had in common is they all spoke the Swiss German language. And so they were called to come down in November of 1861, and then the flood happened after, a month or two after that. So they had barely gotten there. They were still living in dugouts and wagon boxes and whatever they could find to live in.
Sherrie, we're going to come back to you as we go around here. And as I look at Claudia here, Claudia West, and think about what you just said about how your ancestors, and I'm including myself here, our ancestors came from Switzerland and from different places. And I know Paul could probably help us define a lot of those places as we get there. But just imagining them arriving here, speaking Swiss German, coming here when the Jacob Hamlin group and the Indian mission folks were already pretty well established here, and this group of Swiss immigrants come into Santa Clara. Tell us about your ancestors and some of their experiences.
Okay, mine was Johannes Entz, and he actually noticed, they say, a young girl, Amelia, as they were coming across the plains. And he convinced her that they should get married, and they came down. But within that first year, she died giving birth. So then he was helping them back and forth, going up to Salt Lake and back, traveling. And he meets another young lady, Barbara, and she comes down, and they're lucky they have a little girl. Well, within the 2 years, the little girl dies, and then following the same year, the mother was giving birth and died with twins. So now he's lost his 2 wives, and Barbara had a sister, Catherine, that was coming from Switzerland and coming to Salt Lake, and there was no way they could tell her what was going on. So he goes up to Salt Lake, meets her, tells her that her sister has passed away. And honestly, I can't remember right now how long it was that, anyway, they got married and moved to Santa Clara, and then that's where they had all their girls and one son at the time, John T. Ince, and that's where we come from.
Wow. I didn't know about all that loss. And a lot of times we think, the Piners came and they settled and they had their families, but there's so much in each story of personal loss and tragedy and grief and all of that. Paul, tell us about your perspective on all of this.
You used the word immigrants a few minutes ago. I would say refugees. It's incredible to me to read and understand what those people went through and how they survived. It's just amazing. It was survival. And if you had little children and your spouse passed away and you found someone who also had little children, the discussion was, let's bring these together and see if we can't make a go of it and make it all work. And so many times, that's exactly what it was. Our ancestor, Jacob Tobler, his first wife is buried in Council Bluffs, in the cemetery there, the Winter Quarter Cemetery. And, she didn't make it to Utah. So many of them, it's just like they got into this mode of moving to the west, and many of them didn't make it. Those who did were able to survive because they had help from others who were surviving as well.
We always talk about or think about what a beautiful place they left, and it is a beautiful place, and you know it intimately. You literally speak the language, and you've had a lot of experience there, and I know that Sherrie has too. But talk about the place they left. And we know that there's a lot more to the story than they left this beautiful place. For many of them, it was a blessing to be able to leave and to come to a new place. And they were obviously coming to Zion.
They joined the LDS Church in 1850. Let me back up to there. In 1850, the LDS Church sent missionaries into Switzerland. And they went into Basel, Switzerland, and the very first place, as they walked down the streets in Basel, there was a bookstore. And in the window of that bookstore was a copy of the Book of Mormon. And these two missionaries looked at each other and said, "What? How did this get here?" And they went in and asked the owner, and he said, "Well, last year I was up in Berlin at a book fair, and I saw this book, and I thought a lot of the Swiss people would enjoy reading about this." And so he bought it and brought it down to sale at his bookstore in Basel. That's kind of how the missionary work was introduced there, but it wasn't a matter of people who were waiting for the church. There were some who were, but there were many who were not, and those who were not became antagonistic towards the LDS Church and the missionaries. And many of the people who left because of the oppression and the things that were happening to them in Switzerland. The dominant religions were pushing them out. They didn't want them around. It seems to be a characteristic of some places today.
Sherrie, all three of you, but Sherrie, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it's quite interesting when we were in Switzerland. I've gone a couple of times and taken a group to all the places where our ancestors came from. And we were in Schönengrund, Switzerland, and it's where the Tobler family came from. And we were standing in the church parking lot, surrounded in a circle, and the mayor was speaking to us of that town. And she stood there and she apologized to us for the people running us out of town, so to speak, when we joined the LDS Church. And in Rebstein, we saw the church records, and they opened the books for us, and we looked at the books, and they showed us where the names of our ancestors had been scratched off the books because we had joined the LDS Church and left. And I just was helping with the Fry Journal to transcribe it. And they talk about, he was actually in a meeting and was thrown in jail and spent the night in jail just for preaching the gospel. So they went through a lot there, so they were kind of wanting to come to Zion. They had no internet. They didn't know what they were getting into. they didn't know they'd get red sand in their shoes, but
probably couldn't have ever imagined what this would look like.
They were hard workers. They were perseverers. They knew how to work, and they would not give up. And I truly believe that's why they were sent to Santa Clara, because not a lot of people would have stuck it out and made it
so
beautiful.
Awesome to look at the three of you, the 3 or 4 or 5 generations later, with the same names that came and that same ethic. You are all 3 of the hardest workers I know, and I just, all of that comes down through that legacy, which is amazing. And if you think about, I mean, we could maybe we should just try to think about all of those names: Entz, Graf, Fry, Hafen, Tobler, Gubler, Reber, Whitwer.
There's 10 that stayed. There were actually 15 families, and there are, as I've studied them all, there are some that, left, but there wasn't a lot of acreage in Santa Clara. So we know a lot of them went to other towns. So.
However, those names are all still in Santa Clara.
I would love to do a survey of Santa Clara and have people check the box. Are you related how are you related into Santa Clara? And I bet we'd have a good 70, 80% maybe. I don't know. I'm optimistic.
I think you're right on. One of the things we need to look at is what prepared those people in Switzerland to come, to accept the missionaries and to come. And so many times it was dreams, or it was visions, if you will. It was understandings that came to them. It was things that they had experienced that prepared them to receive what the missionaries were bringing. And what I find interesting is in today's world, in Africa, we see things like that happening, and in other countries, we see things like that happening. When the LDS Church first goes into some areas, that's what they find, is people that have had the dreams, people that have received impressions and understandings. As they joined the church in Switzerland, these Swiss people made 2 commitments. One was the commitment of baptism. The second commitment was interesting to me. They promised to go wherever Brigham sent them and not leave until he told them they could leave. Does that help you understand why we're still in Santa Clara? We haven't been told to go.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty obvious why all of us are still in Santa Clara. Yeah. We don't need Brigham to tell us to stay.
I don't think he's going to come and tell us anymore.
No. I'd get along with Claudia. We had lived in Santa Clara. Well, we've been there almost 50 years now, but we had lived in Santa Clara 20 years probably. And my husband was the bishop and in the Valley Chapel, and he came home telling me that they were tearing down the little Relief Society house in the Hug-Gubler home. And they needed to make more parking lot. And we're like, are you kidding me? That parking lot in the back's plenty big enough. They don't need more parking lot. So anyway, Claudia had heard the same thing, and Vicki and Pam Graf, so the 4 of us, and then Clark Kent's was on city council. And so we together banded together. I don't know what we did. But anyway, we contacted the church, and we just said to them, let us buy this. And they were not fixed up like they are today. I mean, they were vandalized and broken down, and not to
define those homes for us, or those buildings.
Okay, the Relief Society house is right next to the church that's still there on the main street in Santa Clara, and back behind it, we call it the Hug-Gubler home because Henry Hug was an early settler of Santa Clara, and that was a name that came also, but then they left and went to Oregon. Long story short, we made it through to the church, and at that time we were surprised because the church is more known for buying property than for selling property, but they did sell it to us, and So
And when you say us,
the five of us,
the five of you
us, period.
purchased that property.
The five of us. And we then proceeded to think of ways to make money so we could pay the payments. And so that's why Swiss Days was started. And so each year we would have Swiss Days, and the money we made would pay the balloon payment. Once a year we had a balloon payment, and we would make the payment on the property. It was $22,000. But along with paying for it, we had to fix them up. You know, we had to do something with them. We had to show the people. The older people in town are like, why would you want those old, places? And why would you want old High and Laura's house?
Of all the houses.
Of all the houses, and why would you want to do this? So like the first year, our theme was the Relief Society house, and thousands of people, and I can't even tell you how many, but lots and lots of people, jumped in to help us. If they couldn't help us monetarily, they helped us physically to work and to clean up. So the first year was the Relief Society. Jump in, Claudia.
I was just loving. I was thinking about the bricks.
Okay, go ahead.
On this, it would be the west side of the Relief Society building. The water from the church was running against it. It was hitting it, and it was just rotting. What do you call it?
Washed it away.
Washing it away. So we wanted to build that back up, and so we got the bricks from
Clausen's house.
Right.
Clausen Price.
So we went down there and we were chipping out the bricks and being so careful. And I remember we were laughing. We were just covered and we didn't even know what we were doing. But we had to get so many bricks to take them. And so we get them there. And who helped us? Who cemented them in for us?
I can't even remember.
I can't remember.
That far.
Again, people helping.
Yeah.
And so we finally get it all done. And then how long was it we had the earthquake?
Yeah. And anyway, so that's why it was adobe brick, and then we ended up having to wire it together and stucco it so it would stay together.
When we had the earthquake.
But all our hard work. I mean, we can tell you the next year was the monument out in front, and the next year we went in and did the Hug Gubler home, and Jay Ants and Floyd and Bruce Dukey jumped in with us and helped us redo that. And now we have a pioneer home that people can see how short we were.
Yes.
And you go through the doorways and you have to duck because...
I don't.
Yeah, you don't because you're one of us.
So, Claudia, you're sharing that, and I'm thinking, I just see in you that same spirit of those original Swiss people who came, and what you and Sherrie and the others did at that time. That was your pioneer effort for another generation, and you came together in the same kind of spirit and the same kind of cooperation and the same kind of joy as those original Swiss settlers.
Well, we loved the history, and we didn't want to see the history go away. And so along with Swiss Days, we would do these family displays. And so we'd have each of the families, like you said, the Gublers, the Whitwers, the Grass.
By the way, I don't think I mentioned Stukeys.
Oh, Stukeys, yeah.
Yes.
We better not leave any out.
As we think of others, we'll...
That's right.
I should have had them right. Anyway, there are 10 that are still, represented there. And we include Staley's in there, even though the Staley's kind of went to Enterprise and Washington and other places. Anyway,
You and I are a good percentage Staley.
Yes, we are. So we're still Staley too. So we did displays, and we'd do them in the church. And when there was the four of us women, we'd do some things up to the park. So 2 would do the park, and 2 would do the valley. And I mean, we did the parade. I mean, for the first so many years, we did it all.
Well, a lot of the things you did at the park, and even down in the valley, were things that youth would have done. We tried to entertain the kids. We tried to keep them coming.
And teach them. The hands-on, we started that right off, and Claudia's still doing hands-on. But I would see all these artifacts come in these displays. And they would come, and then after Swiss Days was over, they would go home. And I'm like, oh, dear, we've got to have a place for these. And at first, we tried to use the Hug Gubler home and the Relief Society house as a museum, but we could just tell they didn't feel like their precious items were secure there. They needed to have a safe home, a safe place. And so Anyway, fast forward, I don't know how many years. Bruce was on city council, and I saw this big empty basement in the in the new city offices. So I said to Mayor Rick, do you think we could have a museum in the basement? And he said, you pay for it and you can have it. So we did. So we jumped in there, and we had wonderful people jump in and do different parts of it. Claudia and Paul were both involved in that, and many, many others. And we decided what was important to us. And I have so many people come in the museum and say, I love how this is set up. And the one thing that rang true was to tell the story. And so that's, as we put the museum together, that's what we tried to do, is tell the story.
What a gift to the community. And again, it's that can-do grassroots spirit that made it possible. It wasn't the city council coming together and appropriating funds and saying, it was you, descendants of those original settlers.
It was our grandpa up there saying,
Right.
you guys
Get it done.
We don't want to be forgotten.
There's something really special about that. And that museum is absolutely wonderful. It's a treasure. It's a priceless treasure. I'm glad we can share that with our listeners, because we're sharing words today and feelings and thoughts and stories. But if you want to actually see what we're talking about, come to the museum.
I'm really surprised how many people who live here, who are natives, haven't been there. Yeah, I mean, one day I was working there, and a couple of guys came from Bern, Switzerland, and they said, we were in Zion, and they said, oh, you've got to go to Santa Clara. And they said, we'd never heard of Santa Clara. And they came walking in, and they were blown away. They loved the displays, and the family names looked so familiar to them, and we just had a great visit.
That's awesome. Paul, take us back to Bern, Switzerland. Take us back. We're going to keep jumping forward and back in time here, but take us back to where did the Grafs come from, and you know where all of us came from. Give us a sense of that geography and how that came together.
Oh well, Bern is more where the Rebbers and the Stukeys came from. Who else? Just those two, pretty much.
The Staleys are pretty close, but
Yeah, they're a little north.
it's all, you know what? Switzerland is the size of Iron and Washington counties combined. It is so small, and people don't think of that because Switzerland is such a, sounds exotic and whatever, and it is, and it's beautiful. I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying it's smaller than what you'd think. So you could actually get to all those fairly quickly. So
we can. In those days, it was they lived in different worlds.
Yeah, and if you lived on top of the mountain, it was a world apart from those in the valley, too.
Yeah.
And the Grafs, you ask where they come from. They come from the extreme eastern part. And as a matter of fact, they're in the valley that has Austria on one side and Liechtenstein just a few kilometers down the valley. And so the idea that they might know somebody from Bern, the only way they could have known them was if they would have come to Santa Clara, because they would not have associated back then. They would have gone probably the other way. The valley runs north and south, and it runs into Lake Constance and southern Germany on the north and into Italy on the south, and is a major thoroughfare.
I first became aware of that geography much more intimately when we first went, and I realized that the Havens came from Scherzingen, right on the shore of Lake Constance. That's where their name came from, because Haven means harbor, and they were on the shore. And I'm going, okay, well, the Grafs must have been around here, and the Gooblers and the Fries. And then I realized, no, they came from all different parts of Switzerland. But when they got to Salt Lake City and when Brigham Young sent them here, they all became a cohesive group. Kind of.
Pretty much.
And that's the thing.
unless water was involved.
Yeah. But even I mean, you would have whatever that kind of was among the Swiss, but then you had the Swiss arriving here with the folks that built the fort and that had been here for 5 or 6 years already here. And that was kind of as well friction. And it's interesting to think about that because we look at history sometimes with these rose-colored glasses, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy physically, but it wasn't easy socially and emotionally and in every other way, especially when a group comes in that speaks no English.
Yeah. And I, too, was under the assumption that everybody came here, everybody stayed strong in the church, and everybody just lived happily ever after. But I studied all the ones who've come, and the Hug family left. He was a bigwig. He had been a missionary in Switzerland for like 5 or 6 years and finally came to Santa Clara. He didn't speak English, and so the church was all basically English-speaking people, and so they would only call people to areas of position that could speak English and communicate with them. And so I blame his wife. So his wife said, "Oh, they're just passing you over. Let's get out of this place," And so they left. And we have some Staley, our great-grandma's sisters, left and went to California. And I kind of said, "Oh, they just weren't strong enough." But after studying their histories and what they went through, they lost a baby on the Muddy. They went to the Muddy Mission, and we're not here to judge anyway. But it was hard. It was really hard.
Well, those greener pastures at that time were in California. And you can't blame people for, especially with the limited amount of land and all the situations. However, it's interesting that now that little valley is the greener pasture for California.
Oh, yeah.
Point.
Yes, for sure.
I think it's interesting when our grandfather, Sherrie's and my grandfather, went to California to see his cousins and his aunts who lived down there, who had been here and had gone down. They treated him royally. And no matter what the relationship was, as far as the religion or whatever, it was family. It was all about family. And he maintained that family connection for many, many, many years.
They were still churchgoers. They loved to sing. They were very musical.
Yeah.
And they found a church there and started going to it. And they just figured, we're still going to a church. We're okay, which is fine for them.
Well, Claudia, when you think of your ancestors, what do you think it is that they stayed? I mean, the Entz family is such a prominent family in this whole region. And they came, they figured it out, and they stayed. What do you think it is that?
To me, it was family and determination. And I don't know if that's a cultural thing from Switzerland, but that's exactly what happened when they all came down. Everybody was a family. I thought I was related to everybody. I thought everybody was my aunt and uncle. I had no idea that I was not related to the Hafens. I thought I was, because Mom always said, don't ever speak poorly of anybody in Santa Clara because you're related to them. So I always thought that we were related, but it's something about family and a strong will and a determination to go on and to not stop and not give up. And that's how, with Johannes, that's what he did. After losing his children and his wives, he continued on. And that, to me, represents, I think, the rest of the Entzes. The other thing, the Entzes, my uncles, they would give you their shirt off their back. And again, that's when Johannes lost his wife, and when the two little twins were born, because they were still alive, then the women in town each took one and tried to nourish it back to health. But they couldn't do it at that time.
Paul, from an economic standpoint, how were they able to stay?
I learned something not long ago that just blew me away. The Swiss in Santa Clara are known to raise fruit and vegetables and to be peddlers. okay? They went out and peddled the wares. And they would go in the 1880s, 1870s and 80s, the mining towns became a godsend, if you will, to the economy of this area, and they would go to the mining communities. Well, I didn't know this, but Nevada passed a law limiting the number of peddlers that could come into the towns, into the mining towns. And so the Swiss in Santa Clara organized and said, okay, you'll go there on this day, and you'll go there on this day, and they had routes that they'd planned. That's why we see Landon and some of these guys of our day who had their routes, because those routes were designated years before as they were working together, and they wouldn't take their own produce. Sometimes they would, but sometimes they'd fill up their truck or their wagon bed with somebody else's produce just to get it out there so they can sell it and move it. And that's the industry working together and resolving problems.
I'm really glad that, I don't know if it was a Hafen route or not, but my grandpa went to Clover Valley where he met my grandma. He was peddling peaches in Clover Valley, Nevada, and that's where they met. But he was headed on some route that would take him to the mining areas. But it's amazing to think about that and how that, and everything we're talking about here are topics that we could expand and that I hope we will expand in the future. Because when you think about that original economy of growing fruit and peddling fruit, that evolved into a company called Rocky Mountain. And Rocky Mountain still exists today. And I was visiting with Brad Stuckey the other day about his dad, Bruce, and the others who were part of that. It's just an epic story that started with the industry of these Swiss people and then became a major industry.
For sure.
When I was talking about telling the story in Santa Clara in the museum to tell the beginning of Santa Clara and how it came to be, the very first display is the American Indians that were there, the native Indians, and then the missionaries, and then the Swiss that came, and the very next one is the fruits and vegetables and the fruit stands, and that's really how they got out of poverty. That's how they were able to say there's no more poor in Santa Clara, and they celebrated, and that was the thing that they did, and still today they take pride in their fruits and vegetables, and a lot of people don't remember, but the fruit stands in Santa Clara, there was probably 25 to 30 fruit stands all along when it was Highway 91. So
it's amazing, though, how many do remember. How when we're talking to people who have moved here, who grew up in Southern California or Northern Utah and were en route back and forth, and how they almost longingly remember those fruit stands in Santa Clara. Again, another whole topic we could spend a lot of time on. Claudia?
Well, I was just thinking working there, because I worked for Wanda. I started in, I think, the 7th grade and worked till my 2nd year of college because she just didn't want me to quit. So I'd come home for the summer, but the best time was working in the fruit stand for the deer hunt. That was so fun, and truck after truck after truck coming out of California and selling all the bushels of apples from there. So that was a real fun time, I think, in Santa Clara history.
That's awesome.
Did you work in the fruit stands? No. I did. I started when I was 12, and I worked for Don Gates for 2 years. He had 2 fruit stands. And then when I was 14, I went to work for Wanda. And when I worked for her, Carol and I would split a shift a day in that fruit stand that was right by our house. And I'd get up early in the mornings and go work in the fields, and then come home and take a bath or a shower or whatever I needed to cool down, and spend the afternoon at the fruit stand. And
so, Paul, you grew up in the days of Elvis Presley, but you were still living the economy that your ancestors started here. You were working in the field, producing the fruit, and then you were retailing it on the street. You
True.
were peddling it
Yeah.
on the street.
Yeah.
And you were too, Claudia. Sherrie and I were in St. George this
I was working at Safeway.
Yeah.
There you go.
And I was working at the tire shop on the boulevards.
So here's another connection for you. Not that it matters. My dad, Sherrie's dad, they were brothers, but they had a sister. I mean, they were a larger family, but they had a sister named Wanda, who's Wanda Fry from the Fry's Fruit Market. And so any fruit that we raised to sell went to Wanda. Mm-hmm. And I used to tell Dad, why do you do that? Why don't you just set up your own fruit stand? No, we're not going to do it that way. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about getting the biggest bang for the buck with your fruit. It was about supporting each other and making sure that Wanda had enough fruit to keep her fruit stand going and working together that way.
Family.
It really, truly.
Family.
Yeah.
And I can remember Dad loading lugs of grapes. Even though he lived in St. George,
He raised grapes, though.
He had beautiful grapevines, and he would load these, and he wouldn't just, throw them in there. I mean, he would pick off all the bad and have them just heaped over this big lug and take them over and sell them to his sister, and he loved that.
That's awesome. Wow. I know that there are lots of places that have legacies, but I can't imagine a place quite like Santa Clara, that all of those original names are still prominent in that town 6, 7, 8 generations later, and that a lot of those same patterns still exist. I mean, I go down to the field and feed a horse every morning, and Debbie, my wife, who grew up right there and had a fruit stand right at her house, she still carries on so many of the traditions that her grandparents and great-grandparents did. All of us do. And it's still all connected to that beautiful little geographic dot on the map.
We learned to bottle fruit and dry fruit and preserve and do everything with the fruits and vegetables, too. So that was a part of it.
I have 5 varieties of peaches in my lot. I live on a very small lot, okay? It's probably 0.15 acres. And yet I've got 5 varieties of peaches. I've got a couple of other types of fruit trees. I've got 3 varieties of grapes. And nobody's really ever told me what kind of peaches or how to take care of my peach trees or how to take care of my grapes. It just feels like it's there. It's part of me.
It's in your...
And you're talking about your dad with his grapes. He had beautiful grapes.
It's in your DNA.
Yeah.
It's just there. I think so. That's amazing. It didn't come down into mine, but...
Well, Dad drove truck for Rocky Mountain for 30 years. My dad did. And he loved going to California, and he would go into the vineyards in California, and he would learn a lot of their tricks of the trade.
Yeah.
And he would come home and teach us about girdling, and there's a bunch of different terms. I don't know. Not that I do it, but I should.
Before we fast forward to your childhood, so let's go back again and continue to kind of set this foundation for who you are. They came to Santa Clara. Brigham Young basically sent them here. They encountered a group already here that were pretty well established, and they were a little bit more, they were Americans. They were frontiersmen and women, not very many women at that time. They were running cattle. They were kind of on the public domain and just doing what they do. And then this group, this really cohesive group of German-speaking folks come into this little valley with a creek running through it, and they commence to turn it into the Garden of Eden. And that's what I call that valley, is the Garden of Eden. We live up on the heights. We like to call that the Celestial Kingdom. But you live down in the Garden of Eden, which anyway, they had those issues, and Erastus Snow finally ended up having Edward Bunker come from Tokerville and serve as bishop. And I know it wasn't as simple as this, but the way I have always thought of it is he told them, well, build some fences. And so the Swiss built fences around their fields and their orchards and their vineyards. And then things started, because those cattle were just going wherever they wanted to go from the original settlers. I know it's much more complicated than that, but they came, and most of those original folks did not, well, I'm sure they spoke some English and learned some English, but it wasn't until the next generation that everyone was speaking English. And I would think that there were, for 2 or 3 or more generations, German was spoken in Santa Clara. And a lot of that still filters down.
It was, but in some families it wasn't as much. And I think they worried that they were going to lose the language. They actually had classes in the evening where they would teach German classes.
Really?
Yeah. And that's been interesting to me, to see that, to realize that they recognize that they might be losing their heritage. And so they had classes to study it.
And then there's this idea that we were called Dutchmen. And maybe you could talk about that. There's the phrase that was used all through the years, and also just that Swiss frugality that ties to that, and something that has always been part of the discussion, that we're Dutchmen and that we're pretty frugal with our funds.
Frugal's the nice word. Tightwads is what we're known for. Yeah.
But all of that is what made it all possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my husband said I didn't get enough of that, I need a little bit more in me. But I look at it 2 ways. So Dutch, and they were Deutschmen because they were German, but they were Dutchmen because somebody that's frugal or tight is called a Dutchman. And so I think the combination of the two is how I always take it.
And I think there's this third component.
Okay.
And that is, if you wanted to aggravate somebody, say something that you knew they felt strongly about, that they would disagree with you. And so, okay, let's talk about my other side and your other side and your other side.
Yeah.
We're only half Swiss here. And my mom was from St. George, and she was not a Dutchman. And the St. George people basically have English or American roots, okay? And if you want to aggravate somebody that can't speak your language very well, call them something that you know is going to stir them up a little bit. And I think there's a little bit of that in there.
But then they became proud of it.
They did.
They were proud to be a Dutchman. Anyway, I know Washington was called Dogtown, and we were Dutchtown. We were Dutchmen. But I've just always thought it's the Deutsch and then the Dutchmen because they were tight. That was my answer to it. But I don't know if there is a real answer to it. But.
Well, what's awesome is that within 10 years, they were living in dire poverty, dugouts, like you were saying, and everything. But within 10 years, they had turned that valley into a productive, really, they had a surplus and were able to help folks in St. George who needed from that surplus.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see, is during that second 10 years is when they started the big building projects here in St. George, the tabernacle and the temple and, even the social hall early on. Santa Clara always contributed a lot of workers to come over and help on those things. And part of it was their tithing, but then they went longer than was expected and received additional help if they needed it.
So, Claudia, when we think about this thing called the Dixie Spirit, all of what we're talking about here, I believe, contributes to that, because we just have this history of working together, the communities, and making things work. And it's not just St. George, and it's not just Santa Clara, and it's not just Washington, but this region that comes together.
Well, every city to me is so unique. And that's what I really like when they have their town celebrations. And everybody is proud of their town. But again, I think we want everybody to succeed. And so again, I keep going back to family. It all comes back to that. We're a community, we're a family. And so the Dixie spirit is, again, determination, hardworking, all of that. That's where the Dixie spirit came from. Just like with building, all of them put the money in for Dixie College over the years to get it to where it is, because northern Utah thought that Utah ended at Cedar City. They didn't even know we existed for so many years. And so I know that those in southern Utah had to be rebels. They had to fight for everything that we got, right? And so that's why I've just been proud of it, of southern Utah, is because of the determination and the willingness to keep going and not giving up.
And it's so wonderful that same spirit exists today, and you've expressed it with the creation of the museum, with just that grassroots. We can make this work. We can do this with Swiss Days, and with the acquisition of the historic property. All of those things. It's that same spirit, only in another generation.
It's so fun to have people come into the museum, and they might just be visiting, or they might have moved here, and they talk about how much they love the area and how much they love coming to Santa Clara and seeing the trees and the small town things that are there. And I think they're talking about the Dixie spirit, and they don't really know how to put a name to it, but it's basically what it is. And I think it's pride. I think it's a lot of pride. We have a lot of pride in community. We have a lot of pride with our families. We have just anyway, we're proud people.
As you identified the towns, we have cousins in Enterprise. We have cousins in Washington. We have cousins in Hurricane, up the river, Mesquite. Yeah, Bunkerville. I mean, and so up and down the river and throughout the county, we have relatives. We have cousins. There's people that we could stop and visit with and who would welcome us in. And that's always been that way, historically, from the very beginning. And so Santa Clara wasn't just an isolated community. Many sisters would marry somebody from another town and go live there and raise their kids. And I remember as a boy growing up, we had a farm. It was, but we had one cousin who always came in October because he liked apples, and he liked the kind of apples that we grew. And so Dad always made sure we saved a couple of lugs for him, and that's just the way it rolled,
Well, there's so much that we could talk about, and everything that we've talked about in this past hour is a topic for another multi-hour podcast. Thank you for sharing what you've shared, and for sharing it so beautifully in such a heartfelt way, realizing that we've just barely touched the surface of these things. But it's been just a special time to be able to talk and to go over this. And I thank you, Sherrie and Claudia and Paul. You're awesome.
You're kind.
Amen.
This concludes part 1 of our visit with Sherrie Anderson, Paul Graf, and Claudia West. Be sure to listen to the next episode of Not Forgotten as we continue our visit with these 3 wonderful people as they reminisce about their childhoods and their memories and the traditions of Santa Clara as they were growing up.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support, and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie